Okay. I think this chapter, the page numbers are different from a physical book. In the library, when you log on with your user ID, you can get chapters from this book, your assigned readings, but it's also on Canvas. I downloaded that for you. And the page numbers are different. They start from page 1 compared to the physical book. Just be mindful. So, elderly abuse is quite prevalent. It's about 10% among those 60 and over. So, it's not something new. And this can happen for older adults living alone through, like what your classmate just said, healthcare providers, they are being ignored. When they mention they experience certain symptoms, certain pains or other things. And healthcare professionals, they just classify everything as part of aging, which may not be true. And it can also happen among community dwelling adults or institutionalized adults. Like what some of your classmates mentioned, it can happen among older adults who live with family. And there are all kinds of abuse taking place. Physical injuries, loss of money, or loss of possessions, especially when they are old. They are functionally impaired, visually impaired, they cannot see well, they don't know what's going on. And they cannot check on their own bank accounts. And maybe they also have cognitive impairment. They don't know what's going on. They have money and valuables stolen when this happens. And these can cause mental health issues on older adults being abused. And sometimes they have to be hospitalized, institutionalized, or even sometimes if abuse is so intense, it can be fatal. And oftentimes, it seems that things that made the news about elderly abuse, it took place in long-term care facilities. And apparently, misdemeanor or crime, or whatever you call it, is socially constructed. Maybe like what you just said, maybe elderly abuse happens since human history started for centuries, a long time ago. But this granny bashing phenomena did not exist until the 70s. Even though we all know abuse has been ongoing since the start of human history, we can safely assume that. And when this granny bashing caught attention of various media platforms during that time, people started to do research on elderly abuse in the 80s. Does that surprise you? We all know that elderly abuse was ongoing since ancient history, and it only caught attention in the US. I think it's in the US in the mid-70s. They call the phenomena granny bashing. It seems that they focus more on the women What about men? Obviously, men were abused too, men and women, since ancient history. And shortly after this, there are other phenomena associated with granny bashing. Some called it elder mistreatment, elder abuse, elder maltreatment, and so on. And this paragraph again mentioned that there are many kinds of elderly abuse. It can be mental or emotional, it can be financial, different kinds of exploitation, neglect, abandonment, among other things. And neglect can happen in many forms. The nature of neglect can vary, like what you mentioned to me. Neglect in nursing home, in long-term care facilities, is very different from neglect taking place between the elderly patient and the healthcare provider. And the neglect taking place in household, in family life, among family members can be very different from neglect happening in nursing home and between the elderly folks and the healthcare professional. And we can safely say that financial abuse takes place often in family situations or sometimes in nursing home too. When somebody is in long-term care facilities, maybe they have cognitive impairment, visual impairment, functional limitations, and they lose control over their finance, whether they like it or not. Some is beyond their control. They don't even know what's going on in their bank accounts. And sometimes financial abuse can also be a form of crime. Financial abuse, whether it's by somebody they know or a stranger, I think is classified as different kinds of crime. My 2 cents. Sometimes, like other people from other age groups, elderly people are not immune to all kinds of phishing email scams and whatnot. And it seems that because there's no agreed upon definitions or meanings for elderly abuse, maybe because of that, it's hard to do research on elderly abuse. Because to this day, there's yet an agreed upon definition and meaning. And I bet the meaning can vary across time and context, across different countries. The meaning for elderly abuse may also vary. And sometimes when older adults, they have all kinds of health problems, all kinds of impairments, they know they are dependent upon their caretakers, whether they are related to the caretakers or not, it doesn't matter. They know, older adults, that they have to depend on their caretakers, and because of that, they are not inclined to report abuse. They just suffer in silence. This could be part of the reason. It seems that after they coined the term granny bashing, even though it did not sound very formal. Only after the 70s, many research have begun on elderly abuse. It seems to me that people were more silent before the 70s. They know it exists, but there were hardly any research on elderly abuse. And it seems that after the 70s, there were major surveys on elderly abuse, large-scale surveys funded by big grants that focus on elderly abuse. And yes, it's a good thing. We have survey studies to gauge older adults' perceptions on whether they experience abuse or not, what kind of abuse they experience. But do you think older adults will be honest when somebody call them on the telephone? Or if they have internet access, will they click on the link to fill out those survey? Will they feel safe to do so? And if this is an in-depth interview, qualitative study, and if somebody, a researcher, interviewer, knocks on their door and they let them in, are they going to be honest reporting when they report their abuse? Or they just say, oh, everything is fine. I did not experience any abuse. Any thoughts? Okay. If we want to study elderly abuse, which is the best mechanism, best method to study elderly abuse? Is that through phone interviews? Through random digit dialing? We are given a list of phone numbers of households with older adults. Above a certain age threshold, we randomly call them. After applying a certain sampling procedure, if we call them, will they answer the phone? Will they be honest with us? Or is that better to do door-to-door survey or door-to-door interviews? And is web surveys the best method if we want to study elderly abuse? If you are quiet, we'll be here until the next 20 minutes. Can I have some takers? Can I have some volunteers? Which is the best way to do research on elderly abuse? Any thoughts? If the researcher plans to do door-to-door survey, he or she has a stack of survey questions, planning to go door-to-door to household with older adults. Do you think that's the best way to do research on elderly abuse?
I think it doesn't really matter what way you do it. I feel like they're going to get a lot of missed reports.
Missed report.
Like no matter what they do, not everyone's going to be honest about their situation.
Okay.
You're gonna get a lot of people who say they're abused and they're not, and you're gonna get a lot more people who are abused and are not saying anything about it.
So some may lie Even though they are not abused, they say they are abused. And the reverse. Some, if the abuser is sitting or standing right beside the person, if a researcher called up, trying to do a phone survey, the abuser is just standing right beside the older adults, the person may not be inclined to be honest for safety reasons. So, do you think web surveys are the best compared to phone surveys, telephone interviews, telephone survey, or door-to-door survey? Do you think elderly folks are more inclined to report abuse if you give them a web survey? Nowadays, we know older adults, they are very tech savvy. They have a lot of time. And we've been through this. We look at a few articles a few weeks back. Elderly adults, they use technology, social media to connect with people living far away from them. So I bet they know how to do web surveys. Do you think web surveys is the safest bet among the two? Or we can just forget about doing research on elderly abuse? It seems to me, if you look at this paragraph, the sample size are not small, more than 3,000 and close to 6,000. It's better than surveys on drug use among the elderly. So you think for yourself. And you are right. Regardless of how we survey older adults through the internet, through phone, or through door-to-door, they are not inclined to report abuse. Maybe they feel ashamed and they don't feel safe. They are dependent on their caretakers, among other reasons, as stated on this paragraph. And if you look at this paragraph, yeah, you have something to say? Okay. If you look at this, it seems that in every continent, there's elderly abuse. In Europe, in African continents, in Latin American countries, in Asia, in America. And studies have been conducted in different parts of the world. And it seems that the most common type of abuse in Europe is mental health abuse, followed by physical abuse. And a very, very small percentage of older adults also experience sexual abuse. And it seems that it's the same in England, even though the percentages vary. And verbal abuse, it has mental health implications. We know that. And neglect. Neglect can be both physical and mental. And it's also prevalent in India, even though they did not report the type of abuse. And disrespect is another common type of abuse related to ageism. Ageism is discrimination against the elderly. And again, neglect is also common in India. And abuse also takes place in Asia and Middle Eastern countries. As you can see, studies have been conducted in Thailand, in Australia, in Turkey. And there's a lack of study of elderly abuse in the African continents. But still, emotional and verbal abuse are common among people in African continents. Any questions